All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shala Chowdhury, and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. Thank you all for joining us for today's workshop on financing for small community drinking water systems. This is a program sponsored by the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network, or LGEN, which ELI manages under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I encourage you to follow the events page on LGEN's website, lgen.net, that's LGEAN.net, and to connect with us on social media for future programs. Thanks to our outstanding panelists and our moderator for joining us today to lend their expertise to this program. So before we begin, I would like to just start with a quick housekeeping announcement. We welcome you all to ask questions of our panelists during today's session. Each of today's modules will conclude with a brief Q&A, and we encourage you to send your questions as soon as you think of them. So please make sure to use Zoom's Q&A feature and not the chat box for that. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Cynthia Harris. Cynthia is the Director of Tribal Programs and the Deputy Director of the Center for State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Her projects at ELI focus on climate change, tribal and indigenous issues, water quality and conservation, product lifecycle management, green infrastructure, and forestry management and conservation. So with that, Cynthia, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Shell. We'll be getting some of our PowerPoint slides up here in a second. And I want to thank everyone who is joining us today, as well as our slate of experts. Welcome, welcome. As Shella mentioned, my name is Cynthia Harris, here with the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network and the Environmental Law Institute, where I'm Director of Tribal Programs and the Deputy Director of the Center for State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this workshop on small community drinking water financing, to make sure you're all in the right workshop today. So next slide, please. This is our mascot, Ellie, saying hi, and here to give you a snapshot, we'll start with our first module, headed by 3 EPA experts who will provide an overview of federal funding and financing resources and other tools EPA makes available to community water systems. Then we have a 10-minute break to give everyone time to stretch, grab a snack, hydrate, and then we return to a spotlight presentation on EPA's Water Finance Clearinghouse, which leads right into our second module, presented by 2 pros from the Environmental Finance Center. They'll focus on budgeting, asset management, and capital planning. And we've allowed plenty of time for Q&A, so please send those questions in. And since we do have a packed schedule, we will get started. Next slide, please. First, we'll take a very quick look at some key stats on just why we're here and why this matters. There are nearly 50,000 community water systems in the US, and they're responsible for delivering safe drinking water to nearly 312 million people, which kind of boggles the mind when you think about this. So keeping up with infrastructure is absolutely crucial for public health and welfare, but it's expensive to do so, especially for smaller systems, which is why, again, we're here today. Next slide, please. We can move to the next slide. Now, without further ado, we're going to get started and bring in our EPA experts, Cassandra Rice, Tara Johnston, and Allison Flanagan. So Cassandra is an attorney advisor with the EPA in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assistance. She's practiced corporate and bankruptcy law prior to joining EPA. There has to be an interesting story there. And has worked in various EPA headquarters and regional offices on multi-statute issues, including on the White House Environmental Technologies Task Force as a DC crimes legal evidence trainer on the Chesapeake Bay Executive Order implementation, as a water enforcement litigator, and on municipal financial planning compliance assistance. Tara Johnson joins us from EPA's Water, Infrastructure, and Resiliency Finance Center, so you know what she has her expertise in. Tara leads communications and outreach for the center and manages EPA's Water Finance Clearinghouse. She started working for EPA in 1998, so she has some stories, I'm sure, and during her career has worked on a variety of water-related efforts, including federal advisory committees, water security, public affairs, assistance to U.S. territories, and much, much more. Allison Flanagan is an environmental protection specialist working in the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water at EPA and serves as the National Capacity Development Coordinator. And prior to joining EPA, she served as a Peace Corps volunteer volunteer in Zambia. Wow. Promoting rural aquaculture and facilitated training events for sustainable agriculture and health education. So Cassandra, Darren, Allison, thank you so much for joining us today. And the mic is yours.
Hi, everyone. I don't see myself, but do I need to? Shayla?
You're good, Cassandra. We can
Okay.
see you.
As long as I can see my slides, that's great. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassandra Rice. I am an attorney at EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. And today I'm going to be talking with you about compliance and planning at small and very small community water systems. Next slide, please. Recently, I read this line and it made me realize that everyone who's joined this webinar has a shared interest in making sure people have access to safe and reliable water, which is a nice feeling to be a part of this group. So thank you, Ella Jane, for bringing us all together here today. Next slide, please. Community water systems are systems that serve the same people year-round, or at least 25 days a year. And small and very small systems make up about 80% of that universe, which means that significant non-compliance at a system can have significant health impacts to the people served by that system, because again, people are ingesting and using the same water day after day. In 2018, about 40% of the nation's community water systems were in non-compliance with at least one drinking water standard. And as a result, EPA and states increased focus on community water system compliance. Next slide, please. EPA released the National Compliance Initiative in mid-2019 with this goal to have a 25% reduction by the end of FY 2022 in the number of community water systems that are out of compliance with health-based standards. And to support this goal, EPA has created a new compliance advisors program and developed a model that can predict at-risk systems so that states and EPA can do some early intervention actions. But the whole focus of this National Compliance Initiative has really been to build capacity at community water systems, especially small and very small systems. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, the overall compliance trends are great. That's that nice downward trajectory. Next slide, please. But if you look at just the small and very small systems and significant non-compliance, you're going to see a slight uptick. And just go ahead and disregard that last bar because that's partial year, it's year to date. So if you look at the second to the last bar, you're going to see a slight uptick. What's the cause? You know, it's unclear, but if I had to bet on it, I would probably bet, you know, pandemic impacts. And it might be that National Compliance Initiative and increased focus on small systems might result in that impact. Or next slide, please. It could be a combination of these common challenges that we see at small systems. And usually it's often more than one of these challenges that we see at systems that are struggling to reach or maintain compliance. And EPA and states have found that direct compliance assistance is the most helpful way to build sustainable capacity and thus compliance at small systems. Next slide, please. So small system operators are juggling a lot of demands. You've got rising operation costs, supply chain delays, you've got changes in water demand as we're all washing our hands and doing more laundry these days. You have customers that might be having a difficult time paying bills, and the list goes on, right? And often it's aging infrastructure that's a significant operational concern. Next slide. But EPA is not the only organization concerned about aging water infrastructure across the country. This is an article from the National League of Cities webpage, but National Governors Association, state governors, Chamber of Commerce, they all continue to raise the alarm that aging infrastructure is a significant national concern. But big news for all of us. Yesterday, President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And this package gives 20 plus billion, that's billion with a B, for Safe Drinking Water Act projects. And an additional 15 plus billion is going to be dedicated to fund lead line replacement. So this is great news for all of us. And to take advantage of this amazing, I think probably once in a lifetime opportunity to strengthen and rebuild water infrastructure, we need to talk about planning. Next slide, please. But first, I want to take a moment to give a quick pitch to the LGene podcast. If you haven't listened to this podcast, you may want to. It runs about 45 minutes and provides useful information about financing resources in a lively discussion-based format. The URL is at the bottom of this slide, but it's probably just as easy to type in LGene and financing podcast into your browser. Next slide, please. So let's go ahead and talk about planning. EPA has created the Financing for Environmental Compliance website to help owners, operators, and government officials identify needs, assess options, and plan for success. The URL, again, is at the bottom of this slide, but it has dashes and all sorts of things. So again, the easiest way to find this website is to type in EPA and Financing for Environmental Compliance, and it'll come right up. We don't have time to talk about each of the 8 steps because then you would not get to hear from anybody else, any of the other presenters. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them today. The first is assemble a team. So this is a financing webinar, so of course we need a person that has financial expertise on the team. But it's important to have a mix of skill sets on this team. Technical, to have an engineer or a long-term operator on the team. Communications, to build support during and after the initial planning process. And other communities have found it incredibly helpful to have a liaison on the team that's good with working with the mayor's office and key community leaders, so that they can explain the planning goals, why you're building a compliance plan, and be champions for the whole process. Then you're going to do a systems needs analysis, define your project goals, and then devise a technical solution. Next slide, please. So technical assessment and selection is another key part of the planning process. And here's a list of several organizations that offer free, that's pretty great, free technical assistance to small and very small water systems. And in fact, EPA gives grants to some of these organizations specifically to provide free technical assistance to small and very small community water systems. I want to draw your attention to the Environmental Finance Center Network. That's that last bullet on the slide. You're going to be hearing from folks at the EFC at the University of North Carolina later today. And the Environmental Finance Center Network staff offer both technical and financial assistance. And there's, I think, now 10 locations around the country. So it's likely that there might be a location near your community. I highly recommend, reaching out to the EFC network if that's something you'd like to do, because they really do have great assistance there. Next slide, please. So EPA and states are partnering to offer a new means of technical assistance. This is through the Compliance Advisors Program. And this program is focusing on small and very small system owner operators and getting one-on-one, very focused technical assistance. To find out more about this program, the easiest way to do that is to contact your state water compliance staff for more information to see if you're a good candidate. And again, you can just type in your state name and then water compliance staff, and you should find your state water compliance contacts there. Next slide, please. So now you've built a terrific team, you've conducted a systems needs analysis, you've defined your project goals, and you've defined your technical solution. You've done a lot. And now you're ready for step 5, which is to conduct a rate analysis. Again, EPA and the EFC network and other organizations have really terrific models that are available to you. Conducting a community-wide financial analysis is very important because eventually you're going to need to explain how your water system needs fit into the community-wide budget. So now that we have all this information, let's take a look at what funding options are available. So next slide, please. So I like to think of this step in the process as quilt making. Most communities will need multiple funding sources to pay for water infrastructure improvements. Frankly, I have yet to see a community that has been able to rely on sole source funding. So you might mix a grant with an SRF loan, or you might mix a grant with a bond, but whatever funding sources you choose can be woven together to fund the entire project. Again, goes back to my quilt making. But the listed programs and organizations you see here, a great place to start when you're doing your financial options review. And I want to draw your attention to, again, that last bullet. It's a potential new funding source, the American Rescue Plan Act. And Tara Johnson, who's our next presenter, is going to be giving you more details about ARPA. Next slide, please. That said, I thought you'd be interested to see how two states, Arkansas and Kentucky, are using ARPA funds to help communities. So Arkansas is spending $155 million, and Kentucky is spending $250 million in ARPA funding to target new construction or improvements in water infrastructure to address long-term noncompliance. Again, this is a really terrific new potential funding source for folks. Next slide, please. So now that you've got all of your information together, you can create your financing plan, but you're not done yet because you have to communicate your plan and use the elements and the data that you've collected along the way to explain why your community and beyond should value this work. And you can do that by creating champions from your customer base, from the technical assistants and financial advisors that have helped you, from state compliance staff, basically anyone who has been involved in this planning process can be a champion for your work and hopefully eventual funding for infrastructure. And with that, we've circled back to what we started with at the beginning of this presentation, which is that we have a shared goal of ensuring that people have access to safe and reliable water. So I'm hopeful that you will let others help you help your community. Next slide, please. That is the end of my presentation. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out to me at the email address that is shown. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cassandra. Sheila, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming in nice and clear, Tara.
Okay. I think we're still having an issue with the slides. It should be the Finance Center one.
Sorry about that. All right.
While we're waiting for that, Cassandra, we do have a couple questions. If you'd like to take one, because I think this one is directed to you.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a great question of what if the utility doesn't have the staff or resources to build out the team? Can the tech resources support non-engineering needs like communications or community outreach?
I'm so glad someone asked that question. So again, I have a mantra that is, if you fix the money problem, you fix the problem. And so even though technical assistance providers are focusing on technical, they're also usually able to help with at least some financial aspects of the planning process and even the planning process itself. And if they can't, then they often know folks who can. State compliance, there are state compliance staff in every state, And they, again, are a terrific source of information and resources and assistance to do just that.
Thank you, Cassandra. Shall Maria go with the slide?
I think so.
Wonderful. Welcome to Zoom world, everyone. Thank you for your patience.
There are definitely gremlins about this morning. So, hi, everyone. I'm Tara Johnson with EPA's Water Infrastructure and Resiliency Finance Center in Washington, D.C. You can go to the next slide. Before we get started, I want to give you a quick background on what we do. At the center, we work on a variety of infrastructure funding and financing issues covering all aspects of the water sector. This includes everything from public-private partnerships, affordability, stormwater infrastructure, and other environmental financial expertise support, such as EPA's Clearinghouse for Environmental Finance. We also provide technical expertise in helping communities determine the best options for funding. Next slide. Since the Water Finance Center's role covers all water infrastructure sectors, as well as providing information on new funding options for communities, EPA's Office of Water tasked us with researching and tracking how the American Rescue Plan Act funds were being utilized for water-related projects. As of October 22nd, we have tracked 664 proposed and approved projects for a total of $19.5 billion. Treasury's interim final rule generally aligns with eligible uses of the funds with the wide range of types or categories of projects that would be eligible to receive financial assistance through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Under the DWSRF, categories of eligible projects include treatment, transmission and distribution, including, as Cassandra mentioned, lead service line replacement, source rehabilitation and decontamination, storage, consolidation, and new systems development. Recipients may not use funds as a state match for the DWSRF program funds due to prohibitions in utilizing federal funds as a state match in the authorizing statutes and regulations of the DWSRF. Local governments will receive the funds in two tranches, with 50% provided beginning in May of 2021, so most communities have already received them, and the balance to be delivered approximately 12 months later. Treasury is interpreting the requirement that costs be incurred by December 31st, 2024 to only require that recipients have obligated the funds by such date. The period of performance will run until December 31st, 2026, which will provide recipients a reasonable amount of time to complete projects funded with fiscal recovery funds. Next slide. I also want to take the opportunity to talk to you today about sustainable financial management planning for water utilities. Many water sector utilities across the nation face mounting financial challenges, aging infrastructure, changes in population, and demand for water services. New environmental and public health challenges drive utilities to look for innovative approaches to ensure that they are on sound financial footing for the future. Some utilities are embracing sustainable financial planning practices by projecting revenue expectations, capital improvement needs, and expenses years into the future. In the process, utilities are examining the adequacy of their capital and operational budgets to meet desired service levels. These forecasting methods support developing a revenue approach to help ensure there will be sufficient funds to address needs that arise in the coming years. Financial planning can be a key component of overall system preparedness, including laying the groundwork for response to crises such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. We conducted 7 case studies with utilities throughout the country and asked them how they are tackling sustainable financial management planning. While the utilities used an array of approaches to sustainably manage their expenses, 3 key themes emerged. The first key theme was to utilize a forward-thinking planning horizon. Shifting to forecast planning for both anticipated costs and revenues helped utilities realize benefits such as stability and predictability. Utilities shared that they were able to elevate their financial planning efforts by formalizing accounting and budgeting changes into official policies. Codifying these sustainable financial planning efforts into policy changes has helped ensure that vision will become reality and remain in place through future changes in leadership and help utilities ensure they are prepared to weather any challenging circumstances that may arise. The next key theme was to consider gradual and predictable rate increases. As utilities undertook steps to improve financial sustainability, they saw the necessity of raising rates in response to the findings of their enhanced financial forecasts and improved understanding of future capital and operating investment requirements. To ease affordability for burdens and respond to local decision-maker and customer concerns, the utilities focused on implementing rate strategies tied to gradual and predictable annual increases. Utilities were able to introduce needed rate increases and rate restructuring to smooth reception from customers and decision makers through proactive communication, which ties into the third key theme. These utilities shared that rate increases can garner acceptance and even support from customers and local decision makers if the need is well understood. The final key theme, which as we saw is closely aligned with the second theme, was proactive communication. Transparent and proactive communication with customers and local decision makers allows utilities to maintain good relationships. Utilities found this to be an essential component of a solid foundation for the future of implementing sustainable pricing approaches. The utilities found that customers are more likely to understand the transition to sustainable financial management if they remember the need to avoid major problems such as outages caused by failing infrastructure. The utilities also found that improving communications between different utility departments was an important building block for success. Opening and maintaining these internal communications channels ensured information needed to support financial forecasts was available on a timely basis and helped to improve the efficiency of what is inherently an iterative modeling process. There are many challenges in implementing sustainable financial planning, some of them substantial. Just beginning the process of shifting to sustainable financial planning is still a significant success. The Center recently held a webinar on sustainable financial management planning, featuring 2 of the utilities from our case studies. We've posted a recording of the webinar and the slides to our website. Next slide. We will also be releasing a full report with all the case studies within the next few months, as well as a learning module in 2022, which will be hosted on our Water Finance Clearinghouse. I'll be talking more about the clearinghouse after our break. Next slide. And here's where you can find us online and more information about the American Rescue Plan Act, as well as how you can contact us after today. Thank you very much, and I will go ahead and turn things over to Allison.
And as we switch over to Allison, we just want to take one quick question, which is that thankfully there are many potential sources for infrastructure, but compliance might depend on operations and maintenance. And do any of you have suggestions for funding for paying operator salaries and/or regular operation costs? So whoever wants to take that one, it's a good question.
Well, I can start off speaking regarding the American Rescue Plan Act. You cannot use that plan to fund salaries or regular operations and maintenance. You can use it to fund bonuses. If they were going to give a one-time essential worker bonus, you could use the funding for that, or communities could if they decided to do that. As far as paying basic salaries and everything, we have a few case studies and things available through the clearinghouse, and I'll walk through how to pull up those resources that might be of assistance there. But otherwise, I don't know of anything off the top of my head specifically to answer that one.
I can jump in, Cynthia. I'm Elsemarie Mullins from the UNC EFC, and we will be going over this later, but typically the best way to cover operating and maintenance costs is with your rate revenue. So we'll be talking about how to set rates and how to determine what your rate requirement should be, and can work with systems more one-on-one as well. But that's typically the best way because, as Tara mentioned, money from SRF grants or other programs aren't eligible for operating and maintenance costs.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And of course, everyone's been generous enough to share their contact information as well if you want to follow up on some of the specifics on your situation. Shelley, are you ready to go for Allison?
All set.
Wonderful. All right, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, so hello, my name is Allison Flanagan, and I serve as the National Capacity Development Coordinator in EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. And as you've probably have heard throughout the presentations with Tara and Cassandra, there's sort of a theme with all of our presentations, which is planning. And so today for my presentation, I'm going to talk about how to have strategic planning in order to build capacity of your water system. Next slide. So I guess the first question, kind of getting it back to basics, which is what is a strategy, and how I break down a strategy is into three main points. And so the first one is the purpose, which explains sort of why we are doing what we are doing. And I'm pretty sure everyone on today's call, our kind of collective mission is to provide safe and reliable drinking water to our communities. And then the strategy kind of serves as the blueprint, the how we are going to meet our mission and goals. And this includes, having, objectives, measures put in place, and understanding what available resources and stakeholders we have. And then the execution is the what we do within the scope of the strategy. So this includes, day-to-day operations and asset maintenance, doing customer service, responding to work orders, all the sort of action items that we do within the water system. And so why is it important for us to talk about strategic planning? And really the main point is that strategic planning will always be relevant because there are so many benefits to have a strategy put in place. Next slide. So although we can't see into a crystal ball or have a time machine to go into the future and see how it's going to be like, having a strategic plan put in place and really investing in infrastructure projects now will not only help us be prepared to overcome challenges such as new regulations or emergencies, but it really can really take into consideration your strengths and weaknesses within your organization. And really with that, it really does shift a bit of the culture within the water system and really practice a proactive mindset, which will ultimately help the systems from going into, a crisis mode. And then the other biggest benefit with strategic planning is communication. Communication is super critical to the success of the planning process. And it's initiated through participation and dialogue, not just within the water system, but also with other stakeholders. And that includes a lot of groups of people, such as your customers, board members, local officials, state and federal agencies, technical assistance providers, nonprofits, community-based organizations, other nearby water systems. And I mean, the list can go on and on. And that engagement is really critical to understand not just what our goals and objectives are of the program, but really understand what resources are available to us, whether it is financial aid or workforce or equipment. which will result in better coordination and more innovative solutions and ultimate success of the program. And then the next benefit is sort of known system needs. So understanding what your system needs through strategic planning can really not just help prioritize, but justify the need to receive financial and technical assistance. And this can really help streamline operations and focus those available resources to the projects that need it the most. A strategic plan really does offer a much needed foundation from which an organization could grow and evaluate its success and make those corrective actions and establish an efficient decision-making process. Another great benefit of understanding your system needs, again, kind of ties back with communication, not just with owners and operators and board members and like other decision makers, but also with your customers. Like I know that someone just mentioned about rate studies and sort of reviewing your rates. If you're going to have a rate increase, you have to sort of understand how to communicate that with your community and with your customers. And really understanding what those needs are really does empower owners and operators from doing so. And I mean, I know that you, throughout this presentation with Cassandra and Tara, you've heard many of the benefits of planning earlier, but it's really important to sort of reiterate those points. And ultimately, really investing in infrastructure will only help improve the sustainability of water systems by improving a system's capacity. Systems that have a strong capacity are more likely to achieve and maintain compliance. And by investing in our water systems, we are creating a more sustainable and equitable future to ensure that all of our communities can have access to clean and safe drinking water. Next slide, please. So another way that I like to look at strategy and sort of building capacity is sort of this iceberg model. So like with an iceberg, you can, when you're at the surface of the water, you can only see the tip of the iceberg. And that's sort of like the observable behaviors and practices of a water system, the level of customer service, compliance, and then in my case, like with drinking water, you know, the condition and reliability of that drinking water. But there's so much underneath the surface that no one really sees, or to, you know, sort of to the untrained eye. And it's everything that goes into those operations of a water system, you know, doing asset management plans, training your operators and owners, rate structure reviews, as we mentioned earlier, engaging and educating the public, communicating with our stakeholders, you know, sanitary surveys. I mean, the list really does go on and on. And so it's really important when we're developing a strategy to really consider all that goes into it. And really having a robust strategy means that your results are much bigger and much more noticeable to the communities. Next slide, please. So actions that can help. So there are actions that you can do right now that build capacity, and not just build capacity, but also can help sort of increase and sort of create the desirability as a borrower to receive loans. Remember how I said the benefits of like understanding your known system needs really can help justify receiving assistance. So one of the actions that I would suggest is trying to establish your baseline and conducting sort of a water system capacity assessment. Many water systems do undergo these assessments when applying for permits or financial assistance from the state. And some states do provide self-assessment, you know, self-capacity assessments and can be found and downloaded online. But there's other assessments like, again, rate analysis or water energy audits, you know, risk and resiliency assessments. Those can also be very valuable to understand your strengths and weaknesses and help you set those goals. And then also implementing asset management plans. And I believe that the EFCs are going to be talking about this later. But I just want to sort of highlight that this is a really awesome tool in the world of capacity development. It's just one of those tools in the toolbox that really targets all three elements of capacity development, which is technical, managerial, and financial capacity. And what's wonderful about asset management is that it really can be applied to everybody, to all sizes, whether you're large or a small system, all types of classes. I mean, it really is wonderful in the sense that everyone can kind of tailor an asset management plan that works for you. And then attending trainings and workshops, just like this one, can be really valuable to understand not just roles or responsibilities, but also learn opportunities and hear ideas and take it back and put it into practice. There's nothing wrong with continuing our learning and continuing hearing from one another. And these are just like a short kind of couple of things that you can do. Obviously, there's a lot more in the world of capacity development, but these are simple actions that can be taken. Next, please. So now I just want to kind of highlight a few financial resources that I think that this group should be aware of to help build capacity and also invest in infrastructure. And the first one is the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. I know that this was mentioned in Cassandra's presentation for a little bit, but this is the priority of this program is really to bring public water systems into and maintain compliance, as well as provide affordable solutions for both infrastructure and non-infrastructure components. And so I will get into the difference between the loan fund and the set-asides, but eligible borrowers are public water systems that can demonstrate technical, managerial, and financial capacity. If the state does determine that a system lacks TMF capacity, that the system may be eligible to receive assistance if it sort of brings them back or builds capacity and brings them back into compliance, and also possibly undergoes some feasible and appropriate changes that in operations, whether if it's, again, reviewing and rate structures or consolidations, ownership transfers. Those are just some brief examples of what that could be. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's really two different parts of the DWSRF program. There's the loan, which is really to invest water infrastructure projects that will help facilitate compliance. And then there's the set-asides. Now there's multiple set-asides within DWSRF, but the two that are highlighted here really just directly impact and assist public water systems. The other ones are more for like state program management. But under the loan program, it could be, more infrastructure based. So treatment and transmission and distribution, storage, consolidation, creation of new systems. Whereas the set-asides are more non-infrastructure assistance. So we have the small system technical assistance set-aside, which is to provide technical assistance to water systems serving less than 10,000 people. And that could be receiving assistance through a third party, operator certification trainings, planning and design for infrastructure projects. And then the other one is the local assistance and other state programs set aside. And this is where the state can use the set aside to help develop and implement local drinking water initiatives and other drinking water programs in the state. So this again could assist in consolidation efforts, support source water protection and wellhead protection projects, and develop and implement asset management plans. Now with the DWSRF program, it does vary by state on what assistance is available. And also some states do provide financial incentives. So for example, some states can give higher priority points or kind of extra points on their application for those that do really have strong capacity practices such as asset management plans. And some even offer like loan forgiveness if owners and board members attend certain trainings. So again, they vary state by state. So definitely reach out to your state SRF coordinator for specific information on this. And also for more information on what eligible projects there are under the SRF program, feel free to check out their webpage and look at the eligibilities handbook. next slide, please. And then the last one that I wanted to highlight is our WIN grant. So the Water Infrastructure Improvements of the Nation Act, or WIN, was enacted in 2016. And really, the purpose was to address meeting drinking water improvements, infrastructure improvements. And these grants were really developed to provide communities that generally would not be eligible for SRF funding, but were still impacted by aging infrastructure and compliance challenges. And they're split into 3 different grants. Next slide. So although there are 3 grants, in reality, there is actually 6, as the program is split into the states and territories from that of the tribal communities. And really they did this to emphasize that there are specific challenges that the tribal communities face versus the states and territories. And so it was best to split it so that way we can serve each group. The first grant is the lead testing in schools and childcare program. And this helps assist schools and childcare programs to test for lead in drinking water. This is eligible to the states, territories, and tribes. It's a non-competitive grant and no match is required. Then the next one is the small, underserved, and disadvantaged communities. Again, this is to support projects and activities for small, underserved, and disadvantaged communities that are unable to finance projects to be in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Again, they're eligible to the 50 states, territories, and tribes. It's non-competitive, but it is a 45% cost share. I believe that this past year, that cost share was waived for the pandemic. Don't know how long that cost share will be waived. So just to let you guys know that there was a cost share under this grant. And then the last one is the reduction lead in drinking water. So this is again to assist disadvantaged communities and schools to removing sources of lead in drinking water. And this one's a bit different in the sense that community water systems, non-transient community water systems, tribes, nonprofit organizations, state, interstate, and intermunicipal agencies can apply. So a little bit of everything. Everyone can kind of apply for this grant, but it is competitive and there is at least a 20% cost share or match. And just like the DWSRF grant, if you want to learn more information, feel free to check out the webpage on WIN grants. And there's a lot of information about what is eligible, who can apply, etc. So that wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much for having myself and my other colleagues on today. I have my contact information, but I also put up our drinking water capacity webpage. On there, you can find resources about capacity development, asset management, operator certification, and also the DWSRF and WIN grants are also available on that website. And we also have a lot of webinars and training events as well. And you can find those webinars also on that website. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Allison. And let's bring all 3 of our presenters back on screen to take your questions. We have a few here. The first one, there's actually 2 that are somewhat related, so I'm going to put them together. And I don't know, Tara, if you want to start with this one. First, there's a question on how exactly underserved and disadvantaged communities are defined and identified. And there's one somewhat related, and is there any data on how many of the systems that receive the ARPA funding serve primarily Black, Indigenous, or other communities of color? And there can be some overlap there.
Those are actually excellent questions. And for the kind of definition question, we actually have our Office of Environmental Justice, and they have developed a tool called EJ Screen. So EJ SCREEN. And that actually will give you kind of a geographic layout of communities that have been identified as underserved or disadvantaged. So that's one tool that you can look at for that. I don't know, when I talked to my colleague there a couple months ago, there wasn't a set definition of what qualified as community facing environmental justice issues. But I know that the way they have things entered into their map system of the EJ screen, that could probably give you a little clarity there. As far as tracking under the American Rescue Plan Act. So it's Treasury's program. And we're not sure how they're going to be gathering the data and what sort of information they're going to be looking at as far as trends to see what types of communities are being impacted by the funding. They were supposed to start collecting data on October 31st. They actually moved the reporting requirement for states, territories, cities and counties and tribes to January 31st. So we were hoping we were going to get some data before the end of the year, but now it's going to look like we probably won't see that before mid to late February. So in that regard, that's the official answer for that. On our end, what we have been tracking is that we are seeing trends of communities using this funding to address previously identified issues where environmental justice was a challenge. We've seen communities who are looking at bringing residents on to the water system who maybe previously didn't have drinking water service and also septic service on the other side of the table. And so they are looking at that. What that equates to demographically, EPA is not tracking that information. These are, again, communities that have self-identified as an environmental justice challenge that they want to use this funding to address. I'm sure Treasury might have a further breakdown as we move forward, but that's not going to be until next year at the earliest.
Yeah, I would also like to add on, so especially for the purposes of the WIN grant and also for SRF, a disadvantaged community is one determined by the state in order to be disadvantaged. So the state also has kind of their own definition for their program. So again, definitely reach out to your state coordinators to see if you fall under their category of what disadvantaged is.
And I'll just echo what Tara and Allison have said, which is reach out to your state, because every state has their own communication pathway with systems and metrics, etc. So the states are really your best point of contact.
Wonderful. We have another question about tribes, and it might be helpful first to preface on resources specifically oriented to tribes and tribal public water systems. And the question is how the EPA Center works with tribal utilities on these infrastructure financing issues, and if there have been any case studies conducted by the center focused on tribal utilities. An excellent question.
Definitely. So we haven't conducted any case studies specifically for tribes. That said, within the clearinghouse, both on our resources side and our funding sources side, we do have a filter option that people, if they're looking specifically for tribal resources or funding options for tribal communities, we do have that filter that can easily be selected and that will populate with information. And I'll give a walkthrough in our spotlight presentation about how you do that in the clearinghouse. Additionally, one of the things that we've been doing in the Water Finance Center is working directly with communities who come into the agency either through their state government or local government or through our municipal ombudsman for water. And they are reaching out and asking questions for us about they're facing an issue, they have these constraints on the utility or their finances, and they need additional help and guidance on that. And so we've been providing that on a case-by-case basis. We are currently working on doing that at a larger level. So it would be states, nationwide. And we've also made sure as part of that effort to include a tribal component to that. So that is something that will probably be coming out in 2022. We just started working on that, building off of this direct technical assistance that we've been giving to communities already.
And I'll put a plug in for the financing for environmental compliance website. There's a whole set of tribal resources available on that site.
Perfect. We have a question about whether funding is available for corporations. And I wonder if this person is talking about private or investor-owned type water utilities. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I can jump in here. So I did pull up, that is one of the eligible applicants filters that is available in the clearinghouse. And so I did just a quick search here. And there are some, it really depends on what the money is going to be used for. Like, what is the project dealing with water infrastructure or source water protection or decontamination or anything like that. And then where a lot of these programs are geographically based. So you would have to go through a state agency to apply. But the best thing I can say would be to look in our clearinghouse, and not to teaser up our spotlight presentation, but again, that'll be in there.
Yeah, I know for the WIN grant, so the reduction in lead, the one that's sort of open to everybody. I do know that like for-profit organizations are not eligible, but like nonprofit, like community-based organizations, municipalities, like they are eligible, but it is a competitive grant. So yeah.
And no one, I don't think, really knows who's going to be eligible under this bipartisan infrastructure deal. So I would reach out to your state.
Terrific. We have a question about PFAS, of course. Can anyone here speak to, one of you three, speak to how funding under the new, I believe, the infrastructure package will work for PFAS treatment? Will it be through the same mechanisms already discussed?
So again, I think that that we're in process in terms of implementation. I do know that there's specific PFAS funding in this infrastructure package. So again, I really think that your state contacts, water staff, are going to be your best option.
We have a bit of a historical question here about the SRF program being set up. I think year 2000, saying it was intended for ultimately reaching the goal that this program would be self-sufficient as a revolving fund for the state. A question if you're aware of any state that's reached this sustainability, or if this is still something we're all working on. Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. As they mentioned, it is a revolving fund. So there is a state match, and these loans that are given out to utilities, they're at a very low interest loan, which makes it very affordable, and that kind of continues the revolving, but not sure about the whole sustainability goal. Yeah.
So to remember, as a revolving fund, the more funds that are available in there, the more the state can allocate out to different localities and water systems. So there you go. A question, how does EPA know which systems need technical or financial assistance? Cassandra, do you want to take that one?
I'd be happy to take that one. First, there is this new model that looks at various factors to predict which systems are going to be at risk for non-compliance. But also there's it's called the ETT. It's a scoring system. So if for certain violations that are likely to get people sick quickly, those get a lot of points. And then as other violations, that are still problematic, but people aren't going to get sick, today, tomorrow, those get less violations or less points. And states and EPA look at cumulative points that are uncorrected. So systems have an opportunity to understand that there's a violation and then correct that problem, and then no points are attributed to that system. But if the violation continues, then points are attributed to that system. And if a system has over 11 points, so 11 or more points, they are considered in significant non-compliance, and that's when additional focus is given to those systems. And again, if you're a larger system, if you're a medium system, if you're a smaller system, that's going to depend on how states and EPA are going to respond to those violations. So as I said, for small and very small systems, you're probably going to be working with compliance staff. And if you're a very large system, you're probably going to be working with enforcement staff.
Cassandra, regarding capacity, and this might be a question for you, Allison, if you could talk a bit more about how borrowers can build capacity. You were talking about eligibility, become eligible for financing under the SRF or other programs. And there was a list of items in one of your slides, everything from training, certification to consolidation. Could you touch on that a bit more? Some pro tips for our participants?
Yeah, so kind of again what Cassandra was saying, like the states do assess capacity. We're not supposed to, or I guess new systems are not supposed to operate without TMF capacity. And so there are steps taken, just like the ETT list and like sanitary surveys, like when you're applying for permits and applying for financial assistance, there is some element of assessing capacity. And so there are a lot of options that you can take, obviously having a certified operator, having asset management plans, having, fiscal management. So making sure that your revenues exceed, the cost of operations. Source water protection can be involved in that as well. So I think a lot of times, a lot of people focus on more technical capacity versus financial and managerial capacity, but those are still just as equally as important. One of my former colleagues, he kind of described it as like a three-legged stool. If you have sort of TMF capacity as a stool, if you just have one of them just a little short, it's going to be uneven and you might fall over, right? So we want to make sure that we build all three of them. But there's a lot of things that go on, and the states have their own capacity development program, again, to have sort of state specific solutions. Capacity issues in Alaska are very different than New Jersey, right? So there's a lot of programs and local technical assistant providers as well that can provide assistance. It doesn't have to be extremely massive. We can definitely start small and build from there.
Thank you. And we have a bit of a quick question whether the EPA model, I suppose, talk about these financing resources apply to both water and wastewater systems. So I understand some of our participants here might be wearing a few different hats.
Well, the financing for environmental compliance website has, it's a multimedia website actually. So it's water, wastewater, RCRA, air, there are resources across that site for various media. And also the new Compliance Advisors Program is for both water and wastewater systems.
And this one question, actually, I like to make sure we ask while we can. Is there, from each of you, is there a best kept secret of funding or financial resource that you don't think enough small systems are taking advantage of but should? You mentioned quite a few so far, but any that you might have just touched on briefly?
Frankly, I think the best kept secret is that if you reach out, is you need to reach out. If you are having a hard time and you don't know where to start, contact your state. Just raising your hand, I think, is a really good first step to getting help.
Can I say ditto? I definitely think ditto, but not just with state and federal agencies, but again, with any kind of stakeholder in your community that could help. I know one of my favorite stories that I've listened to in the past year or two was that a community in Texas, they had some capacity issues, and one of their biggest advocates was a judge in their town. Like, he was the county judge, and he was such a huge proponent of like getting people trained and getting like public education out there, and really connecting the system to the people that they needed. So you can find, supporters anywhere. So it's not just with us, EPA, or your state agency. It's with your community, ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm going to co-sign what Allison and Cassandra said. I think that asking for help is the most important, and you can start with your state, you can start with your local community board, you can come to us at EPA. Believe it or not, we are here to help. And I think that's the most important thing. The other kind of two tips and tricks I would give, one, the EFCs, they're there for a reason, to help with the technical assistance and innovative ideas. So I definitely reach out. We have 10 EFCs throughout the country, organized, I think pretty much according to EPA's regions, how they're laid out, but don't quote me on that. They will probably correct me later, and that's totally okay. So reach out to them. The other thing that I would suggest is, if there's a particular problem that communities are facing that they're looking for financing on, or how to address them, a simple Google search, because over the last year and a half, we've conducted webinars on any and everything. And there's a whole variety of topics that we've been going on. Just in my office, we've been doing stormwater, we've been doing agricultural municipal partnerships. I mentioned the sustainable financial management planning one. So I think by this point in time, just about anything you could think of, someone's probably done a webinar on it. So I would definitely look around for that sort of resource as well.
That's very helpful. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Cassandra.
I was going to say, my EPA colleagues got me thinking that another resource is your next door neighbor system. We had some really positive results where one system reached out to a nearby system, and they ended up buying chemicals together, so they each got a lower cost. One where joint management covered multiple systems. So, if you can reach out to your nearby water system, there might be some shared opportunities there.
That's really an excellent point. One question about resilience, which is something more folks are talking about in terms of preparing for climate change impacts, cybersecurity attacks that we've all read in the news, terrorism, et cetera, especially with the pandemic. Are there any specific resources for resilience, whether within EPA or any of our sister agencies? I believe there's some funding available to help small systems carry out assessments. What would you suggest?
So EPA and states are putting together resources, especially for water systems. Those resources, their EPA is coordinating with Homeland Security and other agencies to develop this information. States are doing the same thing, within their own states. So again, I would probably type in state name, cybersecurity, water, and I am positive that there's some information there, but more information is coming. After 9/11, water system owners and operators really worked pretty hand in glove with state and EPA to assess risk and figure out not just cyber security, but also fence line and moving pathways a little bit away from reservoirs and those types of things. So I would probably recommend reaching out to states.
Allison, you dropped a helpful resource in the chat. Anything else that you or Tara would like to add? I'm sure the center has resources on some of these issues as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I just put a link to our Water Security Division's website, which has a lot of information, not just with financial assistance, but guides, how-tos, like little booklets to kind of review with all things sort of water security, resiliency stuff. The other two that I would possibly mention, like our sister agencies, I would look into FEMA. They have a hazard mitigation program with a couple of grants that can be helpful, and also USDA's rural development water and environmental programs as well. They have a bunch of grants, but also a lot of programs that the states also take advantage, just like the Circuit Rider program. So I would definitely look into those agencies as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in the Water Finance Center, we have been working closely with the Water Security Division, that they use water resilience on their website now. And it's really funny because many years ago I used to work for them, but we've been working closely with them on how utilities can adjust to the pandemic. We've seen several impacts from costs increasing, customers not being able to pay their bills or have outstanding bills. So we do continue to work with them on not just the reacting to an event, but how to prepare for it in the future. So yeah, I would definitely, the link that Allison provided is great. And then we do have some resources in the clearinghouse as well, including several, the FEMA and USDA listed in the clearinghouse that Allison mentioned.
These are terrific. I think we have time for just one or two more questions as we wrap up. We have a question about lead, so not just replacing lead service lines, but the question is testing for lead and identifying the location of lead service lines included in available funding to know the location size of the infrastructure problem.
Well, there's $15+ billion that is being directed for lead line work. Again, what that looks like, I don't think anybody knows at this point, but I would keep my ear to the ground for more information about that.
And as far as keeping the ear to the ground, do you think that information will be up on which websites would you recommend people keep bookmarked?
Well, I would recommend the Elgin website.
Of course.
But also EPA websites are going to have more information as it becomes available, and I am positive your state water program website will have that same information.
Terrific. So we just have a couple more minutes here, so if we could just do a quick round robin, see if there's any takeaways you'd like to leave with our audience. If we could start, I guess in reverse order in which we started. Allison, any big takeaway?
Not really. Again, just I think the biggest thing is just keep on working, keep on communicating, keep on collaborating. I mean, there's no harm with collaboration and communicating with anyone and everyone. And yeah, definitely, use our resources. There's a lot of things out there. You just kind of have to look for it and keep digging. And I know Tara's going to do a demo on the Water Finance Clearinghouse, which has a lot of resources available. So definitely check that out. And thank you again for letting me talk today.
Wonderful. Tara?
So I would say, as we've talked about, reaching out to ask for help, asking for information, that's what we're here for, basically. And I think the other thing would be, we've got a lot of money coming to communities from the American Rescue Plan, from BID. So not only to think about addressing your currently identified issues or challenges, maybe you have a compliance issue that you are faced with, but to think about going forward, what does your future like? And I think that ties back into Allison's presentation about capacity building and thinking in the future, what are your needs? Because a lot of this money, like for the American Rescue Plan Act, you don't have to use it all up until 2026. So it's not 2-year money, it's, you know, now at this point, 5-year money that you could be looking at.
Wonderful. Cassandra?
And I would say embrace your role as a pivotal link in your community's health. That water, the delivery of safe, clean water to people is an amazing gift that you are giving to your community. And you know, if you need help, raise your hand. And just thank you for working as hard as you do, because I understand how hard it can be. But you really are a pivotal point in maintaining public health in your community.
I can't think of a better note to end this first session on. Thank you so much, Cassandra. So we're just going to thank all of you. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much, Stella. And we're going to take a 10-minute break so everyone can stretch. As I mentioned, grab a snack, grab some water, and we will see you all back here at past. We'll be bringing Tara back. She won't be able to escape until she gives us our spotlight presentation. See you in a bit.
Hello, everyone. It looks like we are concluding our break and we'll be moving into the next half of our programming.
Hello, everyone. We're back. As Jill mentioned, we're ready to dive right in with our spotlight presentation on EPA's Water Finance Clearinghouse. Tara, are we ready to go?
I sure am, once I find the unmute button.
Isn't that always how it goes?
Yeah.
And you'd give us quite a few teasers during the previous session, so let's dive right in.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I am excited to give you a quick demonstration of the Water Finance Clearinghouse, EPA's one-stop shop for all things water finance. Next slide. So what is the Water Finance Clearinghouse? Well, to find water infrastructure funding sources and financial technical assistance, communities used to search multiple websites when they needed information on funding and financing options for their water infrastructure projects. In 2017, EPA developed a solution to assist these communities, an online database to host funding and financing sources and technical assistance resources that would be kept current both by EPA and a network of contributors. Next slide. The Water Finance Clearinghouse is actually 2 databases in one. On one side, we have information on funding and financing sources for water infrastructure projects. On the other, we provide technical assistance resources that can be helpful to communities in their decision-making. Next slide. Our goal with the Clearinghouse was an easy-to-use web-based portal to help communities quickly locate information and resources when making decisions related to their water infrastructure needs. To best meet those needs, the database had to be centrally located. In other words, not having to visit site after site, and able to be accessed by all users at no cost. It also needed to be frequently updated and maintained so users would be confident in the quality of data provided. Data that also needed to be searchable so as not to overwhelm users with the information. Finally, we made sure the Clearinghouse was user-friendly with an updated look and feel to demonstrate our continued commitment to running the Clearinghouse. Next slide. The Clearinghouse has 2 types of user accounts, which I'll go into detail about shortly. Of course, anyone can access the website directly at clearinghouse.epa.gov/CHEF and peruse the data without creating an account. However, creating an account provides users with additional features, making future visits to the Clearinghouse easier, and even faster. Next slide. After clicking Create Account in the upper right corner of the Clearinghouse front page, users can then select which type of account they would like to have. Most users will choose a general account. If you have information on water infrastructure funding sources or technical assistance resources, then you would create a contributor account. Next slide. General users can favorite resources and funding sources for quick access during each visit to the Clearinghouse, as well as to subscribe for email updates on new additions or edits to their selected filter options. Contributors can do everything general users can, plus suggesting edits to existing information, suggesting new resources or funding sources to the Clearinghouse, and requesting removal of resources or funding sources if they expire. Next slide. Creating a general user account is quick and easy. Once you submit your email address, we at EPA review and approve the request, which then will provide you with an email confirmation with your login information. That's it. Next slide. So once you've set up an account, how do you use the Clearinghouse? Well, the Clearinghouse was developed with multiple ways to search the data, including tailoring a search for resources or funding by location, and even a few embedded quick searches along the bottom. I'm going to quickly introduce you to using these search features. Next slide. In the center of the Clearinghouse front page are the 3 search options. We'll start with resources. Next. To search our technical assistance resources, we have several pre-made drop-down filters available. Users can search by sector, scope, funding approaches, and more. Within the search results, the data will contain the resource title, which is a link to where to access the resource online, the author, a description, the type of resource, and the year the resource was produced. Within the provided pre-made drop-down filters, users can select multiple filters for their search. For example, if a joint drinking water and wastewater utility wanted to search resources for both sectors, the user could select both. This reduces the amount of searching and self-filtering results, as users can use multiple filters at once. If, while searching, a user decides to remove a selected filter, all that they need to do is click the X next to that filter. This way, users do not have to initiate an entirely new search. Next slide. Next up, how to search for funding. All right, next slide. The Clearinghouse is set up to search funds in much the same way as searching resources. Pre-made filters for funds include source of funding, eligible uses, and eligible applicants. Search results will be listed with a link to the funding option online, the source, a description of the funding, information on how to apply, and the current funding level. Next slide. If you'd really like to drill down and find both funding options and technical assistance resources for your area, our final search feature is a geographic search. Next slide. The map in the geographic search is clickable, so users can select a particular state, but we also have other options under this search feature. Users can search funding and resources not only open nationwide or tailored for their state, but also for tribes, U.S. territories, as well as international options. Next slide. In addition to EPA's regular maintenance and upkeep of the Clearinghouse, we rely on a network of contributors to ensure the data provided is current and accurate. These contributors are individuals who represent organizations providing water infrastructure finance resources and/or managing funding and financing options for water infrastructure projects. Currently, the Clearinghouse has contributors from throughout EPA, from state and local agencies, and from associations supporting the water sector. Next slide. We have more than just funding sources and technical assistance resources on the Clearinghouse. Our learning modules are step-by-step water finance guides developed in partnership with programs throughout EPA's Office of Water. These in-depth guides provide users with a tutorial on a variety of funding and financing options to educate them and support their water infrastructure funding decision-making. Next slide. The easiest way to stay updated on the Clearinghouse and other Water Finance Center activities is to sign up for our mailing list. If you visit the center's website at www.epa.gov/Water Finance Center, all one word, depending on your screen and your web browser, you may need to scroll down to find Subscribe to Updates on the right side of the page. Click Subscribe to Updates and provide your email address and your state or province. You can unsubscribe at any time. Instructions to unsubscribe are provided at the bottom of every mailing list email. Next slide. I know this was quick, but I hope this presentation has given you a good overview of the Water Finance Clearinghouse. Thank you for listening, and thank you for the team at ELI for reaching out to offer this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. I'm wondering if you could drop a link into the chat for everyone, just while they have it fresh in mind to subscribe right this second.
Sure, will do. I'll pull that up in just a second.
Wonderful. We really appreciate it. It's very helpful. And we're going to go now straight to our second module and bring in Elsa Marie Mullins and Stephen Lapp from the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Stephen is a project director at EFC. He works with water systems, local and state governments, and technical assistance providers to improve water systems' financial managerial capacities. He provides technical assistance and training to water and wastewater systems around the country and works on a variety of other environmental finance topics, including affordability and regionalization. Elsa Marie Mullins is also a project director at EFC. She similarly works with water systems, local and state governments, and technical assistance providers to improve financial and managerial capacities. She's provided technical assistance also to water and wastewater systems. She's presented trainings on setting rates, and has authored reports and blogs on a variety of topics. So 2 additional very great resources here to take shameless advantage of them. We greatly appreciate both of you, Elsa Marie and Stephen, for joining us from North Carolina this afternoon.
Thanks, Cynthia. I'm going to do a quick intro and then Stephen will do the first half of the presentation. Thanks. Yeah, as Cynthia mentioned, we're from the Environmental Finance Center and we're hosted in the School of Government at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And yes, we're one of 10 EFCs across the nation. They line up with the EPA region. So we're the EPA region 4 EFC, which covers the Southeast, but we do technical assistance all over the country and projects all over the country as well. We heard a lot of great information earlier about creating strategic plans, communicating, all these sorts of things. And we're going to be taking a step back and laying some of the groundwork for looking at your rates, your finances, your affordability. It's going to be a quick overview. We could spend a day or more on each of the topics that we're going to present today, and we have done that before. But to get us started, I'll turn it over to Stephen, and then I'll pick it up later.
Yeah, thanks, Elsa Marie. Thank you, Cynthia. Again, my name's Stephen Lapp, and I'm like they mentioned, I'm a project director at the UNC EFC. And so we can go to the next slide. And the EFC is a part of a nationwide network of centers. And so if there's not something that we directly have expertise on, we have plenty of resources to connect you with some of our sister centers if that topic is more in their wheelhouse. But we do a lot of kind of direct advising with utilities. Elsa Marie and I do a lot of one-on-one work with water and wastewater systems. We do a lot of applied research and teaching and outreach. So we will kind of mention some of the topics that we provide assistance on, and we will include our contact information at the end of the slide, as well as how to reach out to us for assistance. But please, please take advantage of that resource. And so next slide, please. And today we'll kind of talk about some of the tools and processes to support financial resiliency for small systems. And we'll touch on many of the bullets here during the presentation, And again, we work with systems on lots of these things, so we'd be happy to work with any of you. So first, we'll kind of start with, getting to know your kind of current situation, maybe your assets, your affordability in your community, your financial condition. Look at establishing priorities and goals, identifying a true or fuller cost to running your operation, getting to know your customers, considering future scenarios and changes, establishing rates. And then an important reminder is that these can be a continual process. It's not just a one-time thing. So these might be steps that you've done in the past, but maybe it's time to revisit, or maybe there's some of them you've done and others you haven't. So this is definitely something that everyone can learn from. So next slide, please. So the first resource that we're going to talk about a bit is one of our affordability tools. And this will help, and we'll kind of talk about, assessing affordability in your community. And we'll kind of use our tool to kind of walk you through how you might assess affordability in your community. And we'll use a real systems data that we've worked with in the past, but we'll block their name out to keep them anonymous. So we have a couple animations on the slide. So if you could hit next. So first, we'll see here there's some input. So first we'll select the state in the top corner, next. And if you hit next again, you can see number 2. You can see it will pull up a map. You click on your county. And then once you click on your county, if you hit next again, you can find your kind of census location. And because we're housed in the School of Government at UNC, we have Chapel Hill up here. So you would click on your census place that closest matches your service area. And if you hit next, please. The bottom section you'll see, and for this example, we'll just be talking about water rates. So here you'll enter in your monthly kind of residential charge at 4,000 gallons for water. And if you hit next again, you'll see the last input here is alternative charges at 4,000 gallons. This could be things like comparing water to wastewater rates or the impact of them. This could be looking at inside versus outside rates, or it could be looking at your existing rates compared to proposed or alternative rates. Maybe you're thinking about an increase and you want to see what the impact of that would look like on your community. So those are some of the inputs. And now we'll kind of walk through some of the outputs on the next slide. And we'll kind of talk through some of these socioeconomic metrics that we incorporate in assessing affordability. And so just to kind of orient you with some of the graphs, you'll see the legend, that more kind of turquoise, lighter bar on the left will be the community that we've worked with, those numbers. And then the blue bar on the right will be more of the state numbers. So the first metric that we take a look at is median household income. And so that is, that middle user in your service area, the middle household, what their income is. And so it's important to remember that because it's the middle and median, half of the folks are above and half of the folks are below. And then one last thing to orient you with this graph is that at the bottom of that graph, you'll see some of those numbers are highlighted in red. If it's highlighted in red, that means that that metric is more stressed than the state numbers. So for the community that we worked with, their MHI was about $24,000. So that was significantly lower than the state's, 52,000. So we have that highlighted area because that is more stressed. The second metric that we'll take a look at is the percent of households below poverty level. Additionally, this one was more stressed as well at 32.7% compared to the state's 11.2%. And then that last one on the right on this slide is the percent of unemployment. And this was a little bit lower than the state's average, 2.5% compared to the state's 3.8%. And we have a couple more metrics we like to take a look at on the next slide. And these metrics kind of help frame the conversation as we're talking about affordability, as we're talking about rates, and those sorts of things. So the one on the left here is looking at the percent on Social Security. And so this one was fairly similar to the state average, 34.7 versus 32.1%. If this is a high number, and you can kind of take a look at this with some other metrics, perhaps it could indicate an aging population. The next metric that we also incorporate is the percent of households on SNAP benefits. For this community, they were at 41.7% compared to the state's, 13.2%. So that was, much higher. So that's again going to show up as much more stressed. And then the last metric that we take a look at here is the percent of the population that receives supplemental security income. So this community at 20.8% compared to the state's 5%. So these kind of start to frame the conversation around affordability. And now we can kind of see the impact on the next slide that the rates have on customers. So I may have, mentioned we look at MHI, and a lot of times we universally look at the percent MHI to see the impact that rates have on our customers. But we know it's not perfect because we know that's the middle user. So we try to take a little bit of a zoomed in look at the community by income buckets. And so to kind of orient you with this graph, the blue bars, you'll see that those are the income buckets. So 0 to 10,000, 10 to 15, 15 to 24, and so on. And then that kind of filled in line bar, that's kind of almost like a mountain range, kind of jagged in the background, is showing where the population of the service area breaks down into those income buckets. So we can see here, the impact that the water rates have per income bucket. And we typically like to look at the folks that are in those left 3 buckets, so 25,000 and below, since those might be the folks that are most vulnerable to any changes in rates. So you can see here for this community's water rates, they could spend anywhere from 1.4% up to 3.5% of their annual income on water services. You'll see above the legend section that there's also a button that says owner. This would allow you, if you're using this tool, to see what the impact would be on just homeowners only, since we know many of our renters are paying water bills through their rent. So on the next slide, we can see the impact of alternative rates. So again, these alternative rates could be things like outside rates, they could be proposed rates. For this specific example, these were the community's wastewater rates. So you can see for them, that vulnerable kind of population of those left 3 buckets, so folks making up to $25,000, could spend anywhere from 2.2% up to 5.4%. And so as we kind of figure out, assessing our community and assessing the affordability of our community, those are some things to keep in mind as we kind of talk about rates, and it's important to kind of frame that conversation. And this is just one tool to measure affordability, and it's a free tool that we have on our website, and we linked the tool in these slides. And again, it's also something that the EFC can help walk you through and help you provide some analysis and kind of figure out what that means in the conversation of your water operations. So next slide, please. And now we'll kind of get into, after kind of assessing your affordability, we'll kind of start to talk about assessing your financial health and the financial condition of your water system. And so we'll get into a variety of different benchmarking metrics that will be helpful to kind of figure out where you are, because it's important to kind of figure out where you are before you can kind of be better informed to make decisions around rates or other things. So you need to have that strong base first. So we have a couple of metrics we can click through here. The first being operating ratio. We'll calculate this with and without depreciation. So we can hit next and next again. Then we'll go through debt service coverage ratio, days cash on hand, and we'll go through a couple more, and including quick ratio and the percent of capital assets depreciated. And so for this, we can go to the next slide. This is another topic we have a tool on that's, again, a free resource and on our website. And again, something that Elsa Marie and I can help populate and analyze for your system. You'll see just a quick overview here. We look at a variety of financial or numbers in your financial statements. We like to look at it over 5 years to kind of see the trends in your financial performance. And then some of the outputs include some graphs below. So we'll kind of get into each of the metrics on the next slide. So the first one we'll look at is operating ratio, including depreciation. And to calculate this out, we'll look at the operating revenues and divide that out by the operating expenses. And again, for this, to learn about these metrics, we're going to use some data, again, an anonymous systems data. And for this community, you can see that their operating ratio, including depreciation, kind of hovered above and below 1 over the 5 years that were analyzed. And if and if you hit next again, in the last year that was analyzed, you can see that their operating ratio, including depreciation, was 0.91. And so what this metric is asking is, did the revenue from the water system bring in enough to not only cover the cost to operate day to day, but it also provide enough revenue to cover any future capital costs? And that's what that depreciation number is trying to get at. So we use a benchmark here of 1 because we'd like to be able to at least cover our operating and maintenance expenses as well as future capital. And the tool also allows you to change those benchmark numbers if you'd like to be more ambitious. But for this system specifically, a 0.91 means that they brought in enough to cover their operating and maintenance costs, but maybe not enough to fully cover the cost of depreciation. So we can go to the next slide and see, once we kind of change that metric a little bit, so operating ratio excluding depreciation, that's another one we take a look at. If you hit next and next again, you can see for this system, their operating ratio was well above 1 all 5 of those years. And, it kind of gets at what we kind of spoke about in the previous slide, that they were able to cover their cost of operating, but when it came to covering that cost of depreciation, they weren't fully able to cover it. And depreciation is a good kind of proxy for investing in your system. And we'll talk a little bit about that in another slide. But we can go to the next metric on the next slide, debt service coverage ratio. For this metric, it's a bit of an extension of the operating ratio. And this, to calculate, we'll take a look at the operating revenues minus operating expenditures excluding depreciation, and divide that out by the total principal and interest payments on long-term debt. And so what this, if you hit next, please, what this is asking is, after you covered your costs to operate, how much money did you have left over to cover your existing debt service? So our benchmark value here that we use is 1.2. And so what this means is that you have a little bit of a buffer. If you had just 1, that means you would have exactly enough to cover your debt after covering your operating expenses. A lot of times lenders and funders will want this number to be higher than 1. So we use 1.2. There are some states or some funders that will contractually make you agree to having reserves to cover a certain amount, but that can be a state by state kind of thing. So for this case, the communities in the most recent years debt service coverage ratio is 1.27, meaning that they were able to cover their costs to operate and then have that buffer to cover their operating costs and their long-term debt and have that little bit of a buffer in case if there is unexpected revenue shortfalls or other emergencies, etc. And we'll get to the next metric, which is days of cash on hand. So this is kind of looking at the amount of cash that you have available to your system. And so for this, we'll look in the audited financial statements, we'll take a look in the assets and look at the unrestricted cash and cash equivalents. And we'll divide that out by the operating expenses, excluding depreciation, and then dividing that out by 365 to put it into a day format. And if you hit next, please, we will see that for this community, they had kind of hovered around 400 days over the 5 years. On that last year, they did have 400 days. So what that means is if revenue were to stop coming in, that utility would have 400 days of cash available to them. So, a little over a year, which, a lot of folks ask, how much cash should I have? What is a good number? At minimum, the rule of thumb is obviously you want to have at least enough cash to get through a billing cycle. We'd like that to be a bit higher. For this benchmark, we use 180 days, so about a half of a year. However, this metric has a less intuitive benchmark and is really up to the financial security of the decision makers at the water system. And some folks might be more comfortable with less cash, depending on what it's used for. Some folks might be comfortable with more. We have some folks in North Carolina that experience a lot of flooding or impacts from hurricanes, and they may want a little more cash just to be more flexible to bounce back and be able to respond to any of those emergencies. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how some of these funds can be used. And so the first one, if you hit next, is the Capital Reserve Fund for infrastructure, rehabilitation, or replacement. The next is Repair Fund for known ongoing maintenance issues. The next is emergency funds for unknown, unanticipated maintenance issues. Next would be a rainy day fund for unexpected revenue shortfalls. And all of these, it's kind of a best practice to have these as formalized pots of money for these different things. We know a lot of times folks have them as an informal, one reserve fund, and they use those reserves for all of these different uses. Having them as a formalized pot of money can really just help you so that a decision maker can't come in and try to use funds, for one thing in an unintended way, and it allows all of those funds to be used for what they're intended to be used for. And so, depending on the comfort level of your system, that can kind of influence how much days cash on hand you all would like to have. And we'll go to the next metric, and this is quick ratio. And for this, we look at the current assets minus the restricted assets and prepaid items, because we wouldn't view those quite as much as current. And then divided by current liabilities, we'll take out the deposits and bond anticipation notes. We don't view those as current or in that year, just because we wouldn't expect all of your customers to demand their deposits back at one time. And if we hit next again for our community, we'll kind of see how their metric performed. And so this metric is kind of getting at the liquidity of the fund, and if you had enough, if your assets were enough to kind of cover your liabilities. And so, a metric of 1 would mean that you had just enough to be able to cover your liabilities, which, you want probably a bit of a buffer on this one again. And our target value here is 2, and you can see that for this community, they performed well above that. They were at 5.38 in the last year we analyzed. So that one was a bit more comfortable. Well, it takes us to the next metric, the percent of capital assets depreciated. We touched on depreciation a little bit in that operating ratio. And so we kind of come back here for it again. This takes a look at the total accumulated depreciation over the total depreciable capital assets. And we'll look at the next graph. And this is kind of looking at how much of the useful life of your assets has, already depreciated. And so you can see here that there in the most previous year analyzed, or the most recent year analyzed, it was at 46%, meaning 46% of their assets have depreciated according to what's on the books. So we use a benchmarking metric here of 35%. This is a good, once you start getting around that number, that's a good time to start really thinking about investing in your system and saving ahead of time to do that, so you're not down at that 80% mark and having to do a lot of investment in your infrastructure. One kind of caveat here with depreciation is that this is based off of the way that the accountants put the assets on the books, and it's not based off of a thorough assessment of folks working working day in and day out with the assets or any sort of engineering report. It's just a good proxy if you don't have those things. If you do have a thorough asset management plan or a better understanding of those assets, that would be the better thing to use. This is just that financial proxy for that. And we excuse me, we would like, if you have an asset management plan, that would be a better thing to use, because age doesn't always indicate how that asset functions. So on the next slide, why care about these financial metrics? Why care about analyzing your affordability? First of all, when your funders care a lot about these things, right? And so when you're going to apply for funds, you might have to calculate a lot of these things anyways, maybe the percent MHI, maybe the operating ratio, the amount of cash you have on hand. And so they care about those things, as well as it's really important to kind of be able to determine where you're starting from to determine what the future needs of your system are and determine kind of where you need to go. And so with that, we'll kind of transition to my colleague Elsa Marie, who will continue that conversation of analyzing where you're at and talk a bit about asset management. So Elsa Marie.
Thanks, Stephen. We can go on to the next slide. Yeah. So as Stephen was talking about, it's good to know kind of where you are from a financial benchmarking point of view, as well as affordability. But you also need to know where you're going and how to set some of those benchmarks. What is your revenue requirement? What do you need to raise with your rates? And so that's part of why you do an asset management plan, so you can plan ahead here. So with an asset management plan, you're going to be looking at your assets. We'll get into more of the details. But as was mentioned earlier, it can be part of funding point systems. So you might either be required to have an asset management plan to get funding, or you might get more priority points under a certain scoring system for a state with an asset management plan or a capital improvement plan. It also increases efficiency and reduce costs. So repairing something in an emergency is going to cost more than planning ahead and replacing that asset before it actually fails. Next slide. So what is actually involved in an asset management plan? Go ahead and go to the next thing. First off, you have to analyze your assets and see what do you manage? Where are they? What condition are they in? What kind of trouble do they have? How much are they worth? How much energy do they use? So that's kind of just getting the lay of the land. That is actually only one part of the asset management plan, even though it's a really important one. Next slide. Because after you figure out what you have, you also need to know what level of service you're aiming for. So what kind of consistency, what odor, what taste, what compliance measures are you going to have to be tracking? How will you measure that performance? And that will help you guide the future choices for your assets and figure out and prioritize what needs to be replaced before something else. Next one. So the next piece is the criticality. And we'll go into this a little bit more later, but this is kind of looking at balancing the risks of certain assets failing and how to mitigate those risks. Next slide. As you are looking at your assets, figuring out what level of service you want to provide and how risky a failure of an asset might be, you want to think about the whole life cycle and the strategic plan for operating and maintaining those system assets. So what do repairs look like, not just replacements? Is there a way to rehab if you don't have the money to replace? Or are you considering energy efficiency? Looking at kind of all of those pieces around an asset and not just, is it going to break and is it going to break soon? Then the next piece of the asset management plan is how you're going to fund not only your operating and maintenance, but also your capital replacement, energy efficiency improvements, addressing infiltration issues or non-revenue water issues. How are you going to address those things with the funding that you have and prioritize when and where to get more funding? So the next slide, we're going to get a little bit more into this assessing the asset criticality. So the first part of it is, what is the probability or likelihood that any given asset will fail? Why something might fail? There could be a lot of different reasons. There could be a natural disaster. There could be a man-made disaster, somebody just digging into your pipe. And what is the condition of the asset? So generally, the older an asset is, the higher likelihood the given asset will fail. But only, the folks on the ground will know exactly what that is. As Stephen was mentioning, you can judge depreciation as a number in an audit, and that's a good starting place. But if you have people on the ground that really understand what condition an asset is in, what does your pump look like? What are your meters like? Then you know more fully when they might need to be replaced and what their condition is. So it's really important that you have that kind of base ground knowledge of what's going on with your assets. And you can also hire a consulting firm or reach out to technical assistance providers and possibly get some grants. I know there are several SRF programs that have set asides for asset inventory and assessment. So you can apply to be able to start understanding where everything is and what condition it is in. So that's the first part of criticality. On the next slide, we'll talk about the second part. And that's, so what is the consequence of that asset if it fails? So what's the cost? And are there any legal, environmental, social consequences? So a sanitary sewer overflow has a lot different consequences than a meter going down. And you want to think about not only the financial cost of needing to repair something quickly if a water main breaks, but what are the social consequences as well? So an example of this is, there's a large city in North Carolina that recently had a water main break, and about half the city was under a boil water notice because they were really conservative in what they were estimating the area needed to be, and said, this whole area is under boil water notice, even though it really only affected part of that area. And there was huge pushback from the public on, why didn't they tell us about this boil water notice sooner? Well, they did it as soon as they could. Why am I out of water? What's going on? Why did I get this notice even though I didn't need it? All these sorts of things. So thinking about what all these kinds of different consequences that go along with an asset failing. One way to mitigate or reduce those consequences is through redundancy. So if there are redundant assets, you have, maybe you have 3 pumps that are available, but you really only need 2 to run your water or wastewater system. So then if one pump fails, you have a standby pump at all times. So if, on the next slide, we're going to see a framework of how to map out your asset criticality. And then that will help you prioritize what assets you want to be redundant and which ones you're going to make sure you replace earlier or whatever it is. So on this graph, you can see the horizontal axis is the probability of failure. So this can correlate with age, but again, it's best if you know the condition of your assets, because then that will be more accurate. And then the y-axis is the consequence of failure. So in the lower left quadrant, that green box is low risk. That's something that have a low probability of failure and a low consequence of failure. An example of that might be a brand new meter you put on one household. So the probability is low because it's brand new, and the consequence is low because all you would, the consequence of that meter failing is that you wouldn't have consumption data from that household, from one household for a billing cycle at least, which is a pretty low consequence when you think about the different assets of your system. Say you had a system that, like in Eastern North Carolina, where there's a lot of flooding, and you have a generator and you don't have any backup generators. If it's brand new, it might be in that medium risk upper left category because it's new, so it's not likely to fail. But if it does fail and it's your only backup source of power and you'll likely need it more than once a year because of flooding and where you are, then you'd want to get then that would be a medium risk kind of category. If that was an older generator and it was your only generator in case of anything happening, then that would be high risk. So you can kind of see as you reason out, and then you can map out your assets on something like this. And then that will help you prioritize and see, okay, what's in the top right? What is the highest risk because it has a high consequence of failure and a high probability of failure. And those are the assets you want to be even more proactive about rehabbing, replacing, repairing, or adding something else to be redundant. So it's just kind of a good way to think about prioritizing your different projects. Even though you might say, you know, our meters are really old, we need to replace our meters. Well, it may actually only be in the medium risk category if there's something else that's old or has a really high risk of failure. So really this is helpful to help you prioritize your spending. So with an asset management plan and kind of what we talked about, where you are with affordability, with your financial benchmarks, you do an asset management plan, you might say, okay, this is what we need in order to take care of our system and take care of our customers and make sure that everything is running well. So we're going to go into a little bit of rate setting, which again, we could spend a lot more time looking at this. On the next slide, there are two big rate setting questions. The first is how much revenue do you need? And things like the asset management plan will be super important for that, as well as looking at your operating and maintenance budget and other revenue requirements, your debt service obligations. And then once you know that, you can determine how you're going to allocate those costs among your customers. So the next slide, we'll go through some of what your rates should cover. And you can just click through these. Yep, first off, operates and maintenance, accounting, taxes, contingencies for emergency. This is also your rainy day fund. You want to make sure you're covering your principal and interest on long-term debt. And a lot of these are incorporated into those financial benchmarks that Stephen went through. So if you're regularly calculating those benchmarks, which the EFC can help you with, then that gives you a good idea of where you are and what your rates are covering or not covering. Then additionally, you want to have reserves for capital improvement, and that is also greatly determined by your asset management plan, right? So all these things are kind of linked. If you don't have an asset management plan, it's hard to know how much money you need for capital improvement. And the next one as well, you want to think about source water protection. So next. And all of those are incorporated into your basic revenue requirement. Next. So once you add up everything, then you can start thinking about your rate structure. We're first going to go over some basic rate structure terminology, and then we'll talk about some different philosophies and priorities in setting rates. So first off, if you click next, we'll see this is a fairly complicated rate structure, but we'll go through it. And it can be different depending on where you are. So first off, we have the base charge. In this case, it's $32 a month. Next, Some rate structures include a consumption allowance. So in this case, that $32 a month includes the first 2,000 gallons of consumption. Next, we have the volumetric rates, which are by the blocks next. So the blocks are the consumption thresholds for when you're going to be charging different rates. And those volumetric rates are the per 1,000 gallon charge in those different blocks. So next slide, we're going to go through some of the philosophy of rate setting objectives of, now you know kind of maybe some potential things to include in your basic rate structure. But we're going to go through kind of some of the considerations that a lot of boards and utility staff need to go think about as they're creating rates. And the first on the upper left is the full cost recovery and revenue stability. So this is bringing in enough revenue to cover that revenue requirement, the operating maintenance, the capital needs, the debt service. Moving clockwise, there are also an objective such as encouraging conservation. So you can use a pricing signal, say, charge a lot of money if you use over a certain amount of water to kind of encourage folks to conserve their water and reduce their water consumption. The bottom right is maintaining affordability. So this is just ensuring that all of your customers are able to afford enough water to live on. And as Stephen mentioned, we have a tool that can help, and we talk a lot about affordability and are happy to help you think about affordability. And then the bottom left, you can also price to foster business-friendly practices. So using pricing to encourage businesses and agriculture to locate in your community or stay in your community. So utilities have different objectives, some of which can be supported or discouraged depending on the rate design. So we're going to go through them in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So we have first off that full cost of recovery. Next, so you can click through. These are all things that you want to include in it. And this is probably the most important. And whenever we do trainings where we do a poll about objectives for rate setting, this is typically the #1 priority. Making sure you cover your costs, which is important. So doing this ensures that you can provide your service now and into the future. Next slide. Another one is encouraging conservation. And some of the reasons that people do this, they might be in a place where water shortages are often around. And if you embed in your rate structure this kind of encouraging conservation piece, maybe charging more for a really high consumption or charging a whole lot more for a medium or high consumption, then that will help the utility be able to plan for things and also encourage their customers to think about how much water they're using and discourage overuse of water. The next one, the business-friendly processes, this often looks like a decreasing block structure. So the more that you use, the less it costs per 1,000 gallons, because you want to encourage those high-end users, the agriculture that's using irrigation, those businesses that are using a lot of water or wastewater consumption won't be charged a lot of money for it. So one of the reasons to do this is for economic development reasons. But as you might think, this could be at odds with encouraging conservation. So charging high rates for high usage might encourage conservation, but might discourage businesses from coming into the area. So sometimes these things can be at odds. And the next slide, maintaining affordability, can sometimes be at odds with making sure that you have the full cost of recovery. Because if you want to try to keep your rates lower to make sure that everybody in your system can pay for their water, then you may not be covering your costs. And in the long run, that's going to hurt the system and the service, because if you can't cover your costs and provide safe water, then no one will have safe water, regardless of how much income they have. So it's all a balancing act with these different rate setting objectives. And if that's not enough to think about, as you think about, the rate setting objectives, you also want to take into consider your customers. So the next slide, we'll throw out some of the customers that different things to consider as you're looking at your rate structures and what might be most important. Again, this is a lot of information really quickly, but we're happy to talk about rates anytime. We work with people through them all the time. So you want to know, what's your breakup of residential versus non-residential? Is non-residential more commercial, industrial, institutional? How do you, where is your consumption going? You want to know, in terms of especially affordability, what the incomes and economic status are of your customers, your use of water, and your seasonality patterns. Do you have a high irrigation signal in the summer? It's also great to think about the economic future of large users. Should you plan on that industry staying in the area for a long time, or does it look like they're reducing hours, reducing output, and maybe eventually will leave? And also your population trends. So understanding, is your population growing or shrinking? How does that affect your, not only your revenue that's coming in, but also what kind of capacity you'll need to provide in terms of water or wastewater services. So if you have a shrinking population and you recognize that some of your pipes might be too big for your system, then you can replace them accordingly. Or if you have a really growing population and you know you're going to need a new wastewater treatment plant, you can plan for that when you take into consideration what's going on in your area and your service area and what the future of your utility could be like. So in getting to know your customers, that will help inform how you set your rates. So next slide. We are going to look at how rate setting objectives and different philosophies play out for different customers. It's a little bit of just an exercise. So first, I will kind of use 4 generalizations of customers. First is maybe a senior citizen who doesn't use very much money at all. The second might be a single family household who's about 4,000 gallons a month. The third would be some kind of institution, or let's call it a school, that uses 12,000 gallons a month. And maybe that restaurant down the street uses 34,000 gallons a month. So we're, next slide, going to look at how to get to the same place. So all of these different options get to the same revenue requirement, given the number of customers for the system. So next slide, we're going to go through these one by one. The first philosophy is having folks pay for access. So if you click through 4 times, you could see that this is just taking the revenue requirement and dividing it by your number of customers. So everybody is using the same, everyone is charged the same amount no matter how much they use, but you know that you're going to get your revenue every month because the number of customers may not be changing much, and you always get a certain amount per number of customer or per customer. So this is a great way to make sure that you meet your revenue requirement and revenue stability, kind of that first objective, but it may not be so affordable especially for maybe a senior citizen who's only using 1,000 gallons a month. You might say this is not quite equitable. So, but it's one kind of philosophy. The next slide will show us another philosophy, which is kind of the opposite of that one, which is only paying for the volume of product that you actually receive. So the lowest user would pay the lowest amount. And in this case, it's meeting the same revenue requirement as that $63 a month, but you can see it scales greatly depending on how much you're using. So it's not too bad, but once you get up to the cafe, it's using a charge of $356 a month. That may not be fostering very business-friendly practices, but it might be really affordable for lower end users. So you can see again how there's some tension sometimes between these rate setting objectives. Next slide will show us a third option. And this is kind of this is looking at the fixed costs of the utilities, so things like salaries, operation and maintenance, repairs, that kind of thing. And you put a base charge for all of those fixed costs, and then you assign a volumetric charge for all the variable costs. And usually the variable costs are a very small percentage of the utilities revenue. So oftentimes that's chemicals, maybe energy, things like that. And you can see that it's still not great for the low end users, but the others are probably pretty happy. And this is similar to charging just a base rate because the variable cost, that $1.59 per 1,000 gallons, is not a very big difference there. So this is kind of breaking it out specifically by fixed and volumetric charges. Most utilities, as we can see on the next slide, do some kind of hybrid approach. So the next slide shows us a fourth option, which includes a $25 base charge, which was deemed by this utility to be a reasonable amount, and then a volumetric charge for the rest. So it kind of threads the needle between, you know, we want revenue stability. We need to know we're getting $25 a month for folks. We also want to have the higher end users pay more. So we want to charge more than $1.60 per 1,000 gallons. So it's $6.39 or 37 in this case. And you can see how that plays out. So the next slide, if we look at all of them, you can see, you know, all of these methods come up with the same revenue requirement. It's just a matter of how you're distributing it with your different rate structures. And this is where oftentimes we talk about there's a lot of numbers involved with setting rates, but there's also an art to it. And it depends on what you're comfortable with as the utility staff, what your board is comfortable with when you look at your financial metrics that Stephen was talking about, your affordability. What are you aiming for and how are you going to get there? So the next slide, you know, those are some considerations. The next slide also goes into, there are other elements of rate structure designs that you can incorporate. So things like customer classes. Do you charge different rates for residential versus commercial versus industrial? Do you bill every 2 weeks, every month, every 2 months, every quarter? All these things can also be considered in terms of revenue stability, business-friendly practices, encouraging affordability, and encouraging conservation. You can look at your kind of split between base charges and volumetric charges. You can look at if you include any consumption allowance in your base charge. There are all kinds of factors. So it can be a lot. And as mentioned before also, there's definitely an element of communication with your customers that go along with rate making. So if you have your rate structured in one way and you change it to something else that's really drastically going to change people's rates right off the bat, it might be better to do that gradually. And so the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit through one of the things we often do with utilities, and you can't really see it well on this slide, but we have this water and wastewater rates analysis model that takes into account a whole bunch of different factors that will influence how much revenue you're going to get as a utility. And we'll model out through 5 years on graphs, but then through 20 years in the spreadsheet, what kind of revenues you could see coming in given these different factors. So on the input page, we include your blocks. So this is your base rate, your consumption, your billing period, all those things I just talked about are included in this. And then we take your actual consumption data and put it in there as well. And then we include factors such as how many bills do you not collect per year, how fast is your service area growing. If you're growing very quickly and you have, say, good tap or participation fees as people connect to the system, then that's revenue we want to count. We also take into account your debt service, your operation and maintenance expenses, your transfers to reserves if you want to set aside things into your rainy day fund but aren't specifically for debt service. We can kind of try to get as comprehensive a picture as we can without being too overwhelming. This is really a very cool tool and very powerful because we can talk to systems who will say, okay, you know, we've done it this way, but we're thinking about separating out our commercial class and charging them something different. We can model that. People might say, you know, we really want to raise our base charge X% every year and our volumetric charge a different percentage. Well, we can model that out and kind of play around with it and see what would be best for meeting your revenue requirement and how that would and then you can also look at average bill for different customers and see how that would affect your customer's bill. So the next slide shows some of the outputs for that tool. So on the left, we have kind of the existing rates is that peach color, the dark looks black color is new rates, so that's your revenue in the bars, and then that red line is your expenses. So you can see this utility is covering all of their expenses, they're over their expenses with their rates. And keep in mind that expenses can include transfers or reserves or other things as well. And then another graph folks find often very helpful is looking at the ratio of base to volumetric charges or to revenue. So that's the dark versus the light for the old and the new charges. And that's just helpful to see if you're changing your rates. And so you want to increase your ratio of base charge to volumetric charge because you want to have more stable revenue. You can kind of see how different scenarios will play out. So this tool is one of our suites of tools, but has been a lot of fun to work with utilities and kind of look at what their consumption data is and what their revenue requirement is and what kind of challenges they're thinking about, whether it's choosing a different rate structure, whether it's just raising rates, whether it's setting aside a certain amount for capital projects. We can explore all of that with this tool. So the next slide is just a slew of these tools and some other ones that we offer for utilities. Really, when somebody contacts us to ask for a TA, we often see what their situation is and then suggest what would be most helpful. And the next slide kind of shows up the Environmental Finance Center Network website, and this is the website and the form I already put in the chat for this webinar, and you can request technical assistance for the TA form, and we'll be happy to assist you. As part of the EFC's contract with the EPA, we can provide free assistance to any drinking water system that serves 10,000 or fewer customers, and we can provide free assistance for any wastewater system that is either permitted or treats 1 million gallons per day or less. So this is all assistance we can provide for free. All those tools we talked about, all those different philosophies of rate setting. We're happy to have one-on-one conversations with y'all about what would be most helpful as you're thinking through meeting those revenue requirements and planning ahead for the future. So with that, that kind of wraps up our main content, and I think we can move on to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elsa Marie and Stephen. This is a lot of very helpful information, and tagging off of your discussion of how people can reach you for technical assistance. I'm here. So there are a number of EFCs around the country. Would this just be for people within your region? How would it work? Would people go to their own local center?
No, actually, every center kind of has their specialty in terms of topics. So we usually do TA. Sometimes we run into people that are in our region. We absolutely work with a lot of people in North Carolina, but really whenever we get a request for assistance, we forward it to whomever would be best to serve. So if there's someone who really wants help with their asset management plan, we'll send that to one center. If there's somebody else who really wants help with communicating with their board or their elected officials or their public, then we'll send them to a different center. If they want help thinking about their rates, we'll take that TA, that technical assistance request. So it just depends less on geography and more on what the needs are. And we work together too. So if a utility needs more than one thing, more than one center can work with them.
And once someone fills out the form, they hit send, what's the next step? I mean, what does a typical technical assistance process look like from there?
Yeah, Stephen, you want to start this one and then I can always jump in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes it can be kind of daunting to kind of reach out to an organization, but once you either email us or fill out that request form, we'll get in contact with you, set up a time to have a quick conversation, to hear a bit about your community's needs, things that you're hoping to get assistance with. And then we can kind of marry them with the type of assistance or tools or resources that we can provide. and kind of take it from there. So for example, if you want to look at your financials, we can, talk about that. We'll ask you the types of data we would need to look at. Once you get that to us, we would help, maybe fill out a tool, help walk through that analysis with you. If you're not close to us geographically, maybe you're on the other side of the country, we could have a call like this and share our screen and walk through those spreadsheets before sending them to you, so you're not lost looking at a spreadsheet by yourself. So we like to kind of walk you through whatever we've done so that you can be as up to date with what we did as possible. And then kind of looks a little bit different depending on the need. So that's kind of the basic structure.
And then I've often, after filling out the tools and talking with utility staff, we often do present to boards to kind of bring what we have seen to that governing board. And oftentimes folks really appreciate having a third party there to kind of tell them, what we see as an outsider, because the utility staff may be saying the same thing to their board over and over again, but it can be just really helpful to have folks who've been doing this kind of work all over the country to come in and say, yep, we can affirm this, or yeah, this looks right, or this does seem like you need to raise your rates, or whatever it is, and then kind of have a third party analysis.
We have a question related to that and how much it costs your assistance. I think I know the answer, but I'll let you do.
Yeah, so it's free for any drinking water system that serves 10,000 or fewer customers, and any wastewater system that serves that treats or is permitted for 1 million gallons per day or less. So our free technical assistance is sponsored by the EPA and really tried to target for the systems that don't have as much capacity to hire their own consultants to do this kind of thing.
And on the question of affordability, which you touched on, do you have any ideas for programs that utilities can implement to help lower income customers pay their bills if the rate structure is going to end up, and unfortunately bills being high for some folks? I understand some systems have cross subsidization. In other states, say like California, that's not permitted. What are options and resources for that?
Yeah, I can start, and Marie, please fill in. We do, we from that legal perspective that you mentioned, Cynthia, we do have a bit of an overview on what states allow for, just how you can subsidize or not subsidize, or how you could establish some sort of customer assistance program. Additionally, we have a tool that helps estimate the cost of providing a bill payment assistance program, and so that we can look at a variety of different kind of community factors and see what some of the criteria to receive that assistance might look like, and see what roughly that cost of providing that type of program would be for your community. So we do have some resources there and can talk a little bit about that. As well as we also have started to do some digging on the coming low-income household water assistance program, LIWAP, so we can help people think that looks different state by state, but that's something coming to assist some customers that maybe have been disconnected or have past arrearages, and can help think through those things as well. Elsa Marie?
Yeah, just add the LIWAP is really a response to COVID-19 and folks who may have high utility bills from that. So it is a one-time temporary authorization by Congress, but could be significant. So I'd encourage you to ask in your state, as was said before a lot, contact your state people and ask them where LIWAP is being administered, so you can sign up for that and make sure that you're able to get bill assistance for your customers. Like Stephen said, we're happy to talk through customer assistance programs, ways that you can help customers pay bills. And then also, as I mentioned, your very rate structure can determine how affordable your bill is for for whom. So we're happy to think through any of those things with you. And then also we've found that there's oftentimes community partnerships that can be really helpful for customers to get bill payment assistance. So that's again more on kind of the back end of you already have a bill and you're paying for it. So things like, yeah, third-party nonprofits in the area that already provide maybe rental assistance or energy assistance. They may be able to provide water bill payment assistance as well. And then other programs like leak detection and fixing programs that would help lower people's bills in the first place. There's kind of a slew of ways to help customers. So we're happy to talk through some of those things. And part of that is also, you know, your revenue requirement is driven by all of these different costs. So we can also talk about how to reduce your costs, which will end up being making your bills lower and more affordable for your customers. So it's kind of a multifaceted way kind of approach to think about, you know, those lowest income earners in your service area and how to help them out. There's a lot of different ways we can approach it and talk to you about. And we often find that utilities and their boards are more or less open to different scenarios and different solutions. So I don't know if that answered your question, Cynthia, but there's a lot of different things that can be done.
Very helpful. I'm wondering if one of you could drop a link to some of those resources that you offer in the chat. We do have a question. I'm going to extract a bit out of this because this cites a specific study on the cost of upgrading potential new primary standards for PFAS. But this can be a bit of a larger question, is whenever there are new regulations, of course, systems need to upgrade to meet those new standards. Do you have any comment on that? Obviously, you can't comment without knowing any what the regulatory changes may or may not be, but any suggestions on how systems can strategize if there are any new primary standards coming down the pipeline, if you'll forgive the pun there?
Yeah, I can start this one, Stephen, and then you can jump in with anything else. Yeah, I would say that obviously we don't know exactly what's going to be held yet, but like you said, there's always going to be new compliance, emerging contaminants to be addressed. One of the things that we can do is help utilities plan to pay for their infrastructure. And so we have a tool, especially now that it seems like likely that PFAS will be regulated and utilities might be able to estimate, you know, how much will that cost. We can help you think through how to finance that, what kinds of loans might be out there or grants, or what would that do for your rate raises. And I would also say that, especially in this moment with so much money coming down from the federal government, as has been mentioned, these sort of upgrades to meet those standards are typically really safe investment in terms of some of these dollars coming in. Is this an eligible cost? It would definitely be an eligible cost under the SRF guidance as it is, although things can vary by state as well. And so I'd say keeping your eyes and ears out for potential financial assistance to meet those standards and to do those upgrades, but then also looking at your financing and what kinds of loans are out there, what do your rates look like, what does your revenue look like, how could you make this possible over the years, and then maybe over many years, and we can help you kind of model that out and plan for it. Stephen, did you have?
Yeah, and just how that might look like is, you know, we have a resource, or we could help you think through, you know, if you were to take a loan out, if it's a loan grant package, or you're just paying with your reserves or as you go, what are the different annual impacts on your revenues to meet those different goals or projects. So we can kind of walk you, or kind of go through different scenarios and kind of do a combination of things too. Like we mentioned earlier, some of the funding is a patchwork. So we can try to include as many of the pieces of that patchwork as possible.
We can't forget that quilt that Cassandra had mentioned earlier, and I think that's such a great analogy. Talking about...
Sorry, can I add one more thing? Sorry, one more thing with that, which is true for any kind of expense that you see coming down the line is we work with systems a lot who are looking at different ways to partner with systems in their area to reduce costs. So whether that's sharing an operator or going in with another system to do billing, or actually connecting to another system or merging a system, there's so many ways that can play out. And sometimes when you're looking at like a really high expense upgrade that is going to take a lot more than what your community can afford, you can look around and see what other folks might be in the same place and how you may be able to partner to make that more affordable for your customers.
Or if a neighbor or another utility has gone through that similar process, just that kind of information sharing and best practices can be really informative. So you don't have to go through that alone. You can kind of take advantage of your neighboring systems around you.
Absolutely. Talking about rates, no one likes opening up your water bill statement and saying, oh no, it's gone up, or here's a notification, it's going up 9%, 12%. It's not fun, but it's not fun either for staff and public officials and their staff having to take these calls from irate customers. It can be very difficult to explain all the calculations that go on the back end. Do you have any advice or resources in terms of communicating, not just communicating, but to what level, to what extent customers can be involved in the process? I know some states have, notification commenting rules, but as a pragmatic question, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I can start. And I think that, it's kind of different state by state, determining on the governing body or the utility commission. But I think kind of a general rule of thumb, if possible, is to be as transparent as possible when it comes to why you're increasing rates. So, how you got to that rate perhaps could be important to include. But what are those rate increases going towards? No one likes a rate increase on its own, but folks often like, the repairs or the maintenance or the they want to have a quality service, or they don't want to have the negative impacts of not investing in your system. So perhaps trying to talk through the projects or the different maintenance that those revenues would be going towards, and kind of just having that open dialogue with people and making sure they really understand what the rates are going towards, I think is a really useful starting point. But we know that, a lot of times, usually the most communication people have is that backlash to rate increases. And so having that kind of ongoing conversation, or even trying to, usually that's an affordability concern. And so when you're looking and analyzing your rates, trying to both bridge the concern of revenue stability and bringing full cost of recovery with affordability, and that design can kind of come into place. Are you including a consumption allowance, or do you have different rates for commercial or industrial versus residential, or by meter size? You can kind of get into how that plays out through that rate setting process and design process. But Elsa Marie, I'll let you add to that as well.
I mean, it's been said today, but proactive communication is key, and gradual rate increases can be really helpful too, to not do it all at once. We do have some resources. I think there are other EFCs that have more resources too on communicating with your board and your customers. And I think making sure your board understands why you have the revenue requirement you do. So, it costs this much to repair this thing. And if we do it right now, it'll cost us this much. If we wait for it to be an emergency, it'll cost us even more, which will cause an even greater rate increase, or whatever it is. Kind of explaining how those things are tied to the assets and the level of service, as Stephen mentioned, I think are really important as you're communicating.
Absolutely. And to wrap things up a bit, I'm going to pose to you a similar question as for our EPA presenters. What is the best kept secret, a funding or financial resource that you just don't see enough small systems really taking advantage of, even though they should?
I would say, in addition to reaching out for help, keeping track of your rates and making sure they actually reflect the service that you provide, and knowing that the service that you're providing is really valuable and worth paying for. And so I know a lot of, especially small systems, don't want to raise their rates because they know the customers it's going to affect. And especially if you haven't done rate raises in some amount of years, then it can be hard to do a big rate raise to really meet your requirement. But without that, and without meeting your operating and maintenance kind of standards, then you run into the compliance issues, and you're not able to provide the level of service that you might like to. So I would say maybe the best kept secret is your rates can do more than you think. They can't do everything, but taking a good hard look at your revenue and your rates can really help out with your finances.
And to kind of go off that, and something that I've been thinking about a lot, that we kind of touched on a lot in our presentation, on kind of assessing where you are to kind of prioritize where you need to go. You can kind of assessing where you are can also really help set you up to better take advantage of a lot of the programs and funding coming down too, because you could throw money at X, Y, or Z to help you in the near term, but if you really understand kind of where you're at with financially and with your assets, you can really use these funds that are coming to help move you into a financially resilient position kind of going forward, instead of just that Band-Aid. And so, taking the time to do some of these assessments can be, can take effort, but there are a lot of benefits that you can set yourself up for success with.
Terrific. And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time today, but thank you so much, both of you, coming to us from North Carolina, Elsa Marie and Stephen. And I want to thank again all of our fantastic presenters today from EPA and EFC. We really appreciate your sharing these resources and tips, and we appreciate everyone who joined and participated. If you can move to the next slide. And we do hope that you take advantage of the resources mentioned to benefit your own water systems and the public they serve. As Cassandra so eloquently put it earlier, it's called critical infrastructure for a reason. What you do is so important. We also encourage you to reach out to our experts who have so generously provided these resources and their contact information, and to please also reach back out to us here at LG and let us know your feedback and how you plan on using what you learned here today. We'll be posting these resources on the LG website. We got quite a few questions about that. So yes, the recording will be available. I believe we'll also have the PowerPoint available as well. And finally, please do check out lg.net for a wealth of resources on how local and tribal governments can meet their federal environmental obligations, from water to soil to air, and connect with us on social media as well. So with that, we'll close our final slide, and we will wish everyone a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Shella?
Yeah, Cynthia has really covered all the bases, and I just want to say once again, thank you so much to our audience for all of your great questions today, as well as thank you to our fantastic panelists, Stephen, Elsa Marie, Tara, Allison, and Cassandra, for giving us your time today and all of these fantastic and amazing resources. Everything that's been linked in the chat will also be going up on LGN's website, along with the PowerPoint and the recording, as Cynthia mentioned. So with that, we welcome you to join us at our future LGN events. The link are up on your screen now, and we hope to see you in the future next year. Have a great Thanksgiving, everyone.